I've been dying to tell you this.
Oh.
Okay. So, I'm reading Deviant by Harold Schechter.
Yes.
For this series.
Obviously, yes.
And I've started doing this thing where rather than read and then stop and take notes and read and stop and take notes, I dictate my notes.
Yes.
And that's how I do the script a lot of the time because it's easier. And so last night, I'm finishing this episode up.
Right.
And I'm dictating my notes to the computer. And there came a point where I stopped talking and it was silent.
Oh.
And all of a sudden, the laptop starts typing.
Oh no.
And I'm going to read you what it wrote.
Oh, I'm so scared. You're laughing right now, and I'm not sure if I should also be laughing or if I should be pooping
horrified.
my pants.
So what it typed out were the words, "You sound so pleasant. When I die, me and my sisters will meet you in the next world." I am tearing up here laughing so hard. I think I'm haunted. I'm not even joking. I stopped and that this happens. And then all of a sudden, because Steve was in the kitchen, I'm like, you need to come here. So it's typing everything I'm saying. But it seriously said, "You sound so pleasant. When I die, me and my sisters will meet you in the next world."
But that indicates that it's not a ghost.
I know.
Unless the ghost doesn't know it's already dead.
What happened?
You have a very pleasant voice, though. That's nice.
Thank you.
I love that.
But I was just like, what?
I think, honestly, that would have freaked me out. I would have been like, no, thank you. And shut down.
I wish I could have recorded the look on my face while this happened.
No kidding.
Because I have never experienced something like that. And it was so bizarre because when you do the voice to text, it kind of does 2-3 words at a time.
Yes.
And so this is all coming up and it's just more and more and more. And I'm just like, what?
And the thing is, it's I could understand if maybe there was a TV blaring in the house and it was just picking up on it. But you just said it was silent.
I don't understand what happened.
Oh, that's freaky deaky. I wonder if it'll do it again.
There was the TV playing in the background, but it wasn't saying anything remotely like that.
Well, and that being said, if you had been dictating your notes up to that point,
yes,
and it hadn't picked up the TV,
yes,
why would it be suddenly picking up the TV now?
What happened?
Oh, okay. Well, whoever's listening, that was a very nice compliment,
I suppose.
But also a little freaky, a little obsessed, afterlife. I don't know what that means.
I know.
Me and my sisters?
Yeah.
That sounds a bit ominous.
I know.
Oh, well, I don't know if maybe you need to do a... You hear that?
That sounds like a doggy.
Oh, okay. I was like, oh, please let me not be the only one that's hearing that. Because it was that's so funny because it sounds like it's in the headphones and I'm like, ah.
I am on high alert. And so, yeah, those of you who don't know, I just moved. God. And so now I'm sitting there and I'm like, new house is haunted. Fantastic.
Unexpected. I mean, we've talked about so many stories where it's yeah, the house was built on indigenous burial grounds or, the house had many murders before. So all those things track. This is a brand new house.
Yeah.
So I don't know, man.
I don't know.
I'd be doing a smudge or something.
I know.
Lighting
I'm just
some incense.
Yeah. Anyways.
Anywho. Hello, everyone. I'm Charlotte.
And I'm Dina. Welcome to the Grim Curriculum.
Welcome. We have an exciting one for you guys today, and it's very exciting for us, too.
This fella has been on our list since the beginning.
Mm-hmm. And for good reason. Whether or not you are a big true crime buff, you'll probably know the name or at least part of his story. After all, he inspired the character Norman Bates in the movie Psycho, along with Leatherface from Texas Chainsaw Massacre and Buffalo Bill from Silence of the Lambs.
He will soon be portrayed by Charlie. Is it Hunnam? Hunnam.
I think it's Hunnam.
Hunnam.
Yeah.
Anyways, he's going to be playing him in the latest Monster series, which...
At first, I was like, what are you talking about? You're getting this absolute smoke show of a man to play the monster we're about to tell you about. It doesn't make any sense. But then I saw some photos of him in costume. You know what? Pretty damn close to the real thing.
I'm still mad about Chad Michael Murray as Ted Bundy.
Oh, yeah, gross.
But this, I think I think I'm okay with it.
I'm gonna have to see more for
Yeah.
sure. I know, that what's his name? Ryan, the director. Murphy, is it?
Yes,
Yes,
thank you.
Ryan Murphy. I know he's been controversial in the
Mhm.
past, especially with some of these more sort of biopic kind of series he's doing,
Yes,
because he does take a liberal amount of creative license, I think, when
he
it comes to these
does.
stories, so I'm very curious. But yeah, I guess we'll see how that goes.
Alright, friends, it's time for grave digging, nipple belts,
Yeah.
and skin lamps.
Today, we're starting our series on the one, the only Butcher of Plainfield, or the Plainfield Ghoul, Ed Gein.
Please consider this your one and only warning, because it's gonna get gruesome.
And our main source for this story today is Deviant by Harold Schechter.
I was just telling Charlotte, I cannot get enough of this book.
Well, and I've been reading Did You Hear What Eddie Gein Did? Or
Yes.
Did You Hear What Eddie Gein Done?
Yeah,
Which is a graphic novel, probably one of the only graphic novels based on a serial killer, I would
I
imagine.
guess.
It's absolutely fantastic. So either Deviant by Harold Schechter or Did You Hear What Eddie Gein Done? Definitely check out either or both.
Before we get into the life of Ed Gein himself, we want to paint a picture of the kind of life he was born into, which began and ended in Wisconsin, specifically Plainfield.
Schechter describes it as a name suited for a place so flat and featureless that even an official state guidebook describes it as nondescript. I mean, that's it.
Okay.
Plainfield, it's plain.
Despite that, it was a place met with tragedy. If the fires that often ravaged the town didn't get you, the cyclones, blizzards, or savage thunderstorms would. Men were often shot and killed in hunting accidents or maimed when their trucks collided due to icy conditions. Suicide and murder were also not uncommon.
So Plainville, not that pleasant as it turns
No.
out. As for the Gein family, they were not exempt from this. This seemed to begin with Ed's father, George, who was orphaned at the age of 3. George, along with his mother, father, and oldest sister, climbed into their wagon and set off to run an errand.
The Mississippi River was at an all time high, and the wagon was caught in a flash flood. George was the only survivor.
This is very Oregon Trail.
Yes.
His maternal grandparents took him in, and the majority of his young life seemed to be otherwise uneventful. He completed an elementary school education and eventually apprenticed as a blacksmith in La Crosse.
George worked various jobs and grew up to be a raging alcoholic. He would essentially work all day and then drink his paycheck away at the local tavern.
At the ripe age of 24, he met 19-year-old Augusta.
For an old timey story, this is one of the first times where the age difference hasn't made me want to vomit.
Yeah, I mean, 19 to
It's not
24, it's
great.
not great, but it's certainly not the worst given the time.
Yes.
Augusta was described as a thick set, buxom woman with a coarse face. She was deeply religious and continuously outraged by the immorality brought on by a modern world. She thought life was a business that was meant to be spent working hard and in extreme self denial of all the pleasures the world had to offer.
In all honesty, neither of them sound great. So, what could have been the appeal?
Well, I guess for starters, she didn't really have that many options.
She also didn't know about the raging alcoholism. Despite this, he was a man with no sheer will that she could easily control, which is exactly what she wanted.
And that's exactly what is mentioned in Did You Hear What Eddie Gein Done? They
Hmm.
say, maybe George wasn't that much of a catch, but he was easy for Augusta to control.
Absolutely.
For George, it was the fact that Augusta came from a big family, which was something he didn't have.
The two were married on December 4th, 1899. The marriage itself was a nightmare. Augusta was described as a domestic tyrant and had an intolerance for essentially everything. She would yell at George for being lazy and berate him on a regular basis.
George was constantly drunk, had a weak personality, and withdrew further from the world around him. He would come home from the tavern and refuse to speak to his wife. She would greet him screaming, and he would flail around and hit her in the face.
After the fight was over, she would throw herself down to her knees and loudly pray for her husband to die.
This was legit a regular occurrence in the Gein home.
As for sex, Augusta described it as a loathsome duty that was to be tolerated only for the purpose of child making. Despite this, she desperately wanted a family.
On January 17th, 1902, she got her wish and their first child, Henry, was born.
George was not much of a family man and had a hard time holding down a job. Augusta decided it was time for her to finally take the lead and decided that George should work for himself. The two opened a small meat and grocery shop in 1909 at 914 Caledonia Street.
At first, she let him run the business, but soon after saw that it was too much for him to handle, so she took things over herself.
Augusta was not close with their child Henry and felt that life would be better if she had a daughter. She begrudgingly allowed her husband to sleep with her once again. She got pregnant and prayed every night for God to bring her a little girl.
And with that, Edward Theodore Gein would enter the world on August 27th, 1906. Augusta was upset that he was not a girl, but made a vow to herself that she would do everything in her power to ensure that he would not grow up to be like the rest of them. Her boy would never become like all of those lustful, sweating, foul mouthed men who were determined to use women for their bodies.
She spent her time praying and working to save him from the evils of the world. From an early age, he saw this and did everything he could to keep her happy. Whenever he did displease her, she would tell him in a quiet but stern voice,
Oh, you dreadful child. Only a mother could love you. What a house to be growing up in.
"This is a terrible time."
Absolutely awful for literally everybody in the family.
Yes.
George is weak and an alcoholic. Augusta is a religious tyrant. And these poor boys, who did not ask to be brought into the world, by
No.
the way, are now being parented, if you can call it that, by these two, I don't know, opposing forces, I
Mhm.
guess.
Despite her many, many flaws, Ed looked at his mother as a sort of perfect being. He not only respected her, he both feared and worshipped her. By all accounts, his father was essentially useless, and his mother took control of the home in every sense of the word.
Later in his life, Ed would recall one of his earliest memories. He was standing at the top of the staircase in their old home when he lost his balance. He suddenly felt himself being pushed down by some kind of unknown force. Then, a crushing grip closed around his arm. He looked behind him and saw Augusta standing there with a wild look in her eyes.
She began shouting at him and shaking his body. At that moment, he understood two things. One, he had no clue why his mother had reacted with such anger. And two, from that point on, he would place all of his reliance on her.
And he would never fully outgrow this belief. A lot of people after the fact, almost thought that he worshipped her as some kind of god
Yes.
almost because he was very fearful of her,
Mhm.
but he also didn't particularly like her either.
No.
But he was sort of trapped in this weird mummy son
Yeah,
relationship.
but at the same time, he didn't like her, but he did love her.
Yes, exactly.
It
And that does things to a person's mind.
Oh, absolutely. Another early memory that stood out for Ed was one that is straight out of the many movies he would go on to inspire.
On their property, there was a windowless wooden building that he was strongly forbidden from entering. He would often see animals being led in through the back, followed by the sounds of them screaming. One day, he decided to investigate. He slipped in through the back door and peeked inside.
There, hanging from the ceiling, was a freshly slaughtered hog. His father stood to one side of it, holding it steady, while Augusta slipped a long bladed knife down its belly and exposed its insides. She then reached in and began pulling out its entrails and throwing them into a large bucket.
He couldn't take his eyes off of her. Oh, what a traumatic thing to see as a kid.
Yeah.
And I mean, I grew up again in the country where hunting is very much a thing.
Mhm.
I've been a part of the butchering of a deer or two in my time, but there's something just the way I was brought up with it, it's very educational, very
Yes.
respectful. This, because it seems very like she's made him feel like whatever's in this shed is like taboo and forbidden.
Mhm.
And nothing makes you want something more, especially as a kid, when your parents tell you you shouldn't or you can't have something.
Mhm.
But then to go in and be like absolutely horrified by a slaughtered animal,
Yeah.
ugh.
When Ed was 7 years old, the family had saved up enough money to purchase a dairy farm near Camp Douglas. They remained there for less than a year before they would go on to purchase the home that would eventually become shrouded in infamy.
In 1914, they took ownership of a 190-acre farm in Plainfield. It was a two-story house outfitted with mostly older furniture. The family was not rich by any means, but Augusta took great pride in it and kept it, as she would often say, neat as a pin.
Records would go on to show that this home was purchased by Augusta and the deed was fully in her name. This was, of course, during a time where it was very uncommon for women to have any form of property ownership.
And not only that, the first time they opened their little business, their little shop and general store, it was in George's name,
Hmm.
even though she basically ran the entire situation. Now, when they bought their house, as you just said, it was in her name. And the new shop they opened was also in her name. And
Absolutely.
again, this is early 1900s.
Hmm.
Women couldn't even vote back then. So it was very unusual that she would be the one to control everything.
She would be what we would now consider a boss bitch if she wasn't such a horrific human being.
Exactly. For Augusta, this new home of theirs was perfect. One of the things she loved about it was how isolated it was from the people in the town. In her mind, she was far too good for any of them, and the less interaction between her and them, the better.
She didn't like them, and they didn't like her. Overall, she was shunned by the majority of the town, which was fine. She didn't need any friends. She had her boys.
Ed finished grade 8 by the age of 16. By all accounts, he was an average student who loved to read. His favorites included old timey adventure magazines.
These often told stories of vicious military battles, kidnappings, and sometimes even cannibalism.
That's gonna come up later if you guys hadn't guessed.
Hmm.
Ed had a hard time fitting in at school. He knew he was different than all the other kids, and Augusta really didn't help with this. Anytime he felt like he had made a new friend at school, he would come home excited to tell her all about it.
But his news was never met with happiness. Instead, Augusta would sit there and list off everything that was wrong with not only that particular child, but their entire family.
On one occasion, this poor kid literally comes home and he's like, "Mom, I made a new friend," because no one wanted to be friends with him.
Yeah.
And he's like, "We played marbles. Like, isn't that great?" And she was basically like, "Who?" And as soon as he said the name, she was like, "Oh, you are never to see that boy
Hmm.
again." And he's like, "Oh, okay. Someone was finally kind to me, and I'm not to speak to them anymore."
It's really sad.
Again, it's one of those things where you feel sorry for the child, but not necessarily the person they grew up to be.
Yes, absolutely.
But no kid should have to grow up lonely and bullied and awful. Like, that's just terrible.
And it's the most innocent thing that a child can do is just make a friend.
Yes, that's what we're supposed to do. Humans are social beings. It's important to note that while other folks in town knew he was different, they had no reason to believe that he was dangerous in any way.
He came off as quite the opposite. Ed was quiet and sensitive, and it didn't take much to make him break into one of his crying fits.
Especially when the other kids made fun of his droopy eye.
They would also say that his eyes would flicker around the room whenever he was talking to you. His grin was lopsided, and he had a bad habit of laughing at inappropriate times. Sometimes he'd giggle to himself with no provocation, as if he was laughing at a joke that only he was in on.
It may not shock you that Ed had very little luck with the ladies. Anytime a girl talked to him, he would turn bright red and back away as quickly as possible.
As for Augusta, the farm was not doing as well as she had hoped. It was a lot of work, and George did very little to help. He was prone to anger and took it out on both her and the children. On one night, he accused Augusta of cheating on him during a fight.
Which is actually kind of ridiculous if you think about it, because not only does Augusta hate George, she hates men in general and everybody else.
Yeah.
So she is not going to be going out and seeking other companionship. She's, quite frankly, better off alone.
Oh, absolutely. She has her boys.
Exactly.
She literally thought that sex was some sort of a punishment that you had to endure if you wanted to have a child.
While George was out drinking, which, again, he did every night, Augusta would read Bible verses to the boys. She'd take them by the hand and make them swear that they would keep to themselves and stay away from the lusty, dangerous women that roamed the town. I also want to point out that they actually moved to Plainfield because it was less sinful than the
Yes.
previous place they'd been living, that as soon as Augusta had been there for 10 minutes, she's like, "No, this is just as bad."
Oh, she hated every she literally hated everybody.
I don't think she would have been happy in paradise, to be
No.
honest.
By 1937, George was, by all accounts, a wasted man. He fully relied on his own family to take care of him, which was a task they all did begrudgingly. After all, he had spent their entire lives together earning every ounce of hatred that he received.
George Gein passed away at the age of 66. The Gein family did not consider this much of a loss and went upon business as usual.
In the 40s, both Ed and Henry were able to avoid the draft. Henry was too old at that point, and Ed was rejected due to his eye, which slightly impaired his vision.
The loss of George may not have affected the family too much emotionally, but it did mean that there was one less person around to help work on the farm. Both Gein men took on odd jobs to help out and make extra money for the family.
Despite his strange traits, Ed was considered to be somewhat well liked, like we said. He didn't cause issues and he seemed to get along with people quite well. He was polite, but odd.
He found some work as a handyman and had a reputation as a hard and dependable worker. He also found work as a babysitter.
Ed Gein, the babysitter.
Oh, let that sink in. I mean, hindsight is crystal clear,
Yeah,
and it was a different time,
yeah.
but I don't think I'd be asking just some guy from town to look after my kids.
No. He had a hard time making friends with people his own age, but got along very well with children.
Which is interesting because he didn't get along with other kids when he himself was a kid, but now that he's an adult, he probably finds a lot in common with them.
He would roughhouse with the boys and do magic tricks for the girls. Ed would regale them with stories from his magazines, again, involving cannibals.
Yeah, I don't know if some of the parents were cool with that.
Like, looking at what we know now, the idea of Ed Gein babysitting a bunch of kids and doing magic tricks.
Ed Gein being within 2 miles of any child,
Yes.
not good.
It's horrifying. I hope that we see that in the monster series. I want to see
Mm,
Charlie Hunnam doing some magic
some
tricks.
babysitting. Ed and his brother Henry actually had a fairly good relationship. There was definitely a level of respect between the two, and there's no doubt that Ed had a lot of admiration towards his brother. But there was one sore spot between the two of them: Augusta.
Henry noticed that the relationship was abnormal, and he tried to bring it up to Ed on multiple occasions, but the conversation never really went anywhere.
This brings us to the next tragedy that the Gein family would suffer: the death of Henry Gein.
On May 16th, 1944, Henry and Ed were fighting a runaway fire on some marshland near their home. Some versions of the story say that it was accidentally set, while others believe the grass fire was started to deliberately burn off dry grass.
Later, Ed would say that the entire thing was Henry's idea, but newspapers would report otherwise. According to Ed, a strong wind blew the fire out of control while they were on either side of it. When the fire was finally put out, Henry was nowhere to be found.
Ed rounded up a search party that included Deputy Sheriff Frank Engel, and they made their way back to the site of the fire.
The first thing that struck everybody as strange was that Ed maintained he had no clue where Henry was, but when they arrived on scene, he took them directly to Henry's lifeless body.
Something else that made no sense was that Henry's body had no burns on it.
Mm.
His clothes were covered in soot, but his face was clean, and they also saw that he had some bruises on his head.
When they asked Ed how he was able to locate the body so quickly, when he claimed that he couldn't find it, he agreed with them, shrugged, and said, "Yeah, funny how that works." You're gonna notice a pattern with Ed. He literally kind of tells people the truth
Yeah,
the whole time, but because people don't think much of him or don't think he's capable, they just like, haha, Ed, you're so funny, and move on with their
I
lives.
think that they think of him as somewhat of a dullard.
Yes.
He's just that weird guy.
But he's helpful, he's
Yeah,
polite, he's good with kids, so you think, well, he's odd, but he's not a bad
he's
person.
not dangerous.
Ultimately, Henry's cause of death was ruled to be asphyxiation, and there didn't appear to be any foul play. That being said, years later, after everyone had learned about Ed Gein's crimes, it was certainly considered suspicious.
The townsfolk gossiped about this often and even compared the death of Henry to the story of Cain and Abel.
The thing to remember about Ed is that despite his notoriety, he was only ever charged with the deaths of two people. There are many who believe that there may have been more and that Henry Gein could have been his first victim.
What do you think?
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, we're
Yeah.
on the same page.
I think so. Because allegedly, and truly the only person that's ever really going to know this is Ed.
Mhm.
And he's unfortunately or fortunately, depending on how you look at it, not on this earth anymore. But some people think that Henry had kind of finally had enough with Augusta,
Mhm.
was like, mom's fucking crazy and I need to get out of here. Like I'm going. I'm gonna go start a
Yep.
new life, gonna marry someone new, and I'm just gonna leave here. And they think that is what kind of triggered Ed because that was the point between them. The contention was always
Yes.
Augusta. And like you said, anytime Henry was like, hey, Ed, don't you think mom's a little, And Ed would be like, oh, you shouldn't talk about mama that way.
Yeah,
You
mama's
shouldn't,
perfect.
mama's God. You can't talk about her
Yeah.
like that.
I think he may have insulted her or said something like that, and Ed just snapped.
Yeah, 100%.
With Henry and George gone, Ed finally had his mother all to himself. Even in his late 30s, he considered her to be an all powerful being, capable of anything and everything.
Which is why it came as such a huge shock to him when she began to complain about feeling unwell and faint. It got so bad that he took her to the hospital. She was weak and had to be taken to the examination room in a wheelchair.
Ed sat in the hallway waiting for news. When the doctor finally arrived, he explained to him that Augusta had suffered a stroke.
Ed would spend as much time with her at the hospital as was allowed, and when she was allowed to come home, Ed was eager to take care of her. In his mind, it was finally time for him to prove his worth to her.
Despite his wiry frame, Ed managed to carry her into the house and lay her on the bed. And I'm going to say this, Augusta,
She was a large
she
lady,
was a large lady.
and Ed is not a big
No,
man,
wee teeny.
but he was pretty determined to look after
Yeah.
her. Actually, in later years, Ed's crimes would be questioned because it was hard to believe that someone so small was capable of things that would require a considerable amount of strength. So we want to go ahead and explain this now.
Because again, we're talking about the grave digging. Spoiler alert. He's going to dig up
Yes.
some graves.
Yeah.
Ed was skinny, yes, but he had that farmer strength.
Mhm.
He out there lifting hay bales and stuff. He's
Yeah.
working the fields, and he was a lot stronger than he looked.
Probably not much to look at in the sense he wouldn't have looked like Arnold Schwarzenegger kind
Yeah.
of thing, right? But he was wiry, and honestly, he probably was just full muscle.
Oh, yeah.
Because, I mean, nutrition wouldn't have been super, super great, and he was hardworking all
Mhm.
the time. It broke Ed's heart to see Augusta so frail, but her helplessness also excited him. She was finally in his care, and by taking care of her, she would not only owe him gratitude, but her life.
Slowly, she began to regain her strength. He was obviously happy about this, but at no point did she express any of the things that he had hoped for. It was simply business as usual.
Apparently, taking care of Augusta is a thankless chore.
Yeah.
During the winter of 1945, the farm still had a little bit of livestock left. Augusta told Ed that they needed to get some straw for the animals, so they went to a neighbor by the name of Smith to purchase some.
When they arrived at his house, they saw Smith savagely beating a puppy. As the dog screamed in pain, the woman that Smith lived with ran out and began yelling at him to stop.
Smith continued to beat the dog until it laid on the ground, dead.
I hate it.
I hate that too.
Augusta was incredibly upset by the scene that had just played out in front of them. Not because they had just seen a man beat an innocent puppy to death, but because the woman living in his home was not married to him. On the drive home, she complained loudly about Smith's harlot.
Which really confused Ed too, because Ed genuinely thought at first that she had been sort of put off by the fact
Mhm.
that he had just witnessed, or they had both witnessed, this man beat a puppy to death. And then as she started to complain in the truck on the way home, she goes, That slut coming out there, they're not married." And Ed was like,
A puppy
"Oh,
just died.
okay,
Yeah.
all right, Augusta." Less than a week after the incident on Smith Farm, Augusta suffered a second stroke. She was once again taken to the hospital, but despite all efforts, Augusta Gein died on December 29th, 1949.
And with that, Ed Gein was all alone.
And that is where we'll pick up next week for part 2 of our Ed Gein series.
One thing I want to add,
Yes.
her death, Ed was the only one that saw this as a loss.
Yeah. Oh, no one else gave two hoots.
No.
In fact, they were probably happy that this old, ornery bitch of a woman was no longer around to cause any damage.
When Henry and George died, they both got long obituaries in the paper. Henry was on the front page.
Yes.
And Augusta had a short, like, matter-of-fact death announcement printed about her. Some of her siblings did show up to the funeral along with Ed, but otherwise no one bothered. No one wanted to come and see her and pay their respects. But after the funeral, he told people that he had lost his best friend and his one true love.
Oh, Wisconsin, what's happening over there?
I know.
You produce a lot of serial killers, my friends. I'm just bugging.
I'm not. It's a pattern.
So true.
Where's your head at?
I mean, this, like, I saw all the classic horror movies that were inspired by Ed long before I'd ever heard of Ed Gein.
Yes.
I'd read the Hannibal books, I'd seen Psycho. Texas Chainsaw Massacre absolutely freaking traumatized me. I watched it in grade 7 and it made me sick to my stomach. Chainsaws still bother me to this day. Do not like, especially playing Dead by Daylight. 0 out of 10. Hate those little bastards with the chainsaws. I just, like so many serial killer stories, and people argue whether or not Ed is really a serial killer or not. That's up for debate. But with so many serial killer stories, they have these horrific, tragic, arduous childhoods that no one should have to live through. But I know what he ends up doing. You're reading a horror story where you already know the end.
Yes.
So you start feeling sorry for him, but you know what he's gonna do.
Yeah. Like, you feel sad, and then you're like, he made a belt out of nipples.
Yeah,
this isn't a box.
This isn't a Survivor story.
No.
We're just getting to it.
Yes.
I want to know your guys' thoughts too. Like, what are you've known about Ed for a long time.
Since I was too young to know about Ed.
Yeah.
I honestly, he's such a complicated person for someone who is considered to be quite dull. And I think with him, it's interesting because I wouldn't say there's any like pivotal point where he goes down the wrong road. He's one of those examples of, we always talk about nature versus nurture.
Yes.
And I think Augusta doomed him from the start.
I think so too. Being so isolated, not having any friends of his own. See, the thing is with Henry was a little bit sharper than Ed. Let's put it that way. Henry had friends. Henry was a little better looking than Ed. And Henry had come to the conclusions about his family and kind of understood that my family's pretty weird and this isn't normal and I kind of need to get out of here.
Yes.
No one else in the family did. As much as George clearly hated Augusta and everything else, George was weak and he never made an attempt to leave. And I think it's the attempt to leave that Henry made that kind of snowballed everything out of control. And then, as we'll learn next week with next week's episode, Augusta's death is really where Ed starts to completely nosedive in, if you will.
You want to know something really fun about next week's episode?
Please tell.
It's on our 3rd birthday.
Oh, how appropriate.
I know, I love it.
We're also coming up to our 150th pretty soon, too.
Yeah, holy crap.
I mean, we're probably going to sit down here in the next little while and come up with our next topics for the foreseeable future.
Yes.
But if you guys have anything special that you maybe want us to cover for 150, we've got some ideas already, but we're open to suggestions. So if there's some...
My birds are going crazy. It's the ghosts.
I must. Plus, it's still daylight out. So
That's
they're
true.
like, it's daylight. Why are you talking?
It's our time.
But yeah, if you guys want to hear anything special for 150, please let us know across the social medias, in the comments, send us an email, thegrimcurriculum@gmail.com. We would freaking love that.
Yeah. Also, if you haven't listened to Extra Credit,
oh yeah,
go listen to Extra Credit. What are you doing?
If you only listen to the main show and you're not aware, we have a what would you call that? Bi-weekly show, I guess.
Yeah.
Every 2 weeks, we release another episode on Wednesdays where Dina and I, we bring our own topics to the table. We have a little bit of a back and forth. It's a little more easygoing, more of a conversation.
Mhm.
Sometimes we talk about true crime news, sometimes we talk about cool science things or cool history things, and we always wrap up the episode with a strange and unusual death. So if you want more grim content, check out Extra Credit.
We got a comment on, I think, like, episode 4 of Extra Credit.
Mhm.
Someone had written in and they said, "I've been listening to you guys for a while. I finally just listened to the second show, and I can't believe I waited this long." So, don't
Well,
be like that
there
person.
you go. That's straight from the horse's mouth, guys.
Love it. It is now the time of the episode where we wanna thank
Yeah.
all the beautiful people on Patreon.
Mhm.
Friendly reminder, there is a free tier, you get early episode reveals. There is also a tier for Discord.
Yeah.
We do video episodes, we do all of that fun stuff,
Mhm.
but our Grim VIPs get an episode shout-out.
They sure do. So, a humongous, thankful shout out to Yegpla, Mayhem Mudkip, Lisa, Nova, Kevinus Musicus, Brian, Bob, Paranoid Pop Rocks, Steven Centuri, Judy, and Atlantean Jedi. Thank you, thank you. You're the cat's pajamas, the bee's knees, all that good
Hell yeah.
stuff.
Thank you all so much for listening. This has been
The
The
Grim
Grim Curriculum.
Curriculum.
I have a strange and kind of creepy coincidence that I heard
Oh,
about. Robert Lincoln,
okay.
the son of Abraham Lincoln,
Yes.
was saved from falling off a train platform and being run over by Edwin Booth, brother of John Wilkes Booth.
Whoa. What are the chances?
Oh, isn't that wild?
Love.
Yeah.
Bye.
Bye.